Many of us have heard that there is something wrong with kids who hurt animals. Well, then surely there's something wrong with Red the Pokemon trainer. He's gotten hundreds of animals to fight each other. What's his problem? Well, as with Mario and Link, the most appropriate diagnosis for Red might be conduct disorder. This is when a person shows a repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior that violates the rights of others or other age-appropriate societal norms. There's a long list of criteria that go along with conduct disorder, so I'll list the ones that seem relevant to Red. Often initiates physical fights. Has used a weapon that can cause serious physical harm to others. Has been physically cruel to animals. Though Red isn't starting physical fights between himself and another person, he's starting fights between his Pokemon and other people's Pokemon. And some of these Pokemon are extremely dangerous, such as the 1,600-pound Steelix or the Scyther, which has swords for arms. He makes these animals fight until they lose consciousness. These Pokemon battles also seem to interfere with other aspects of Red's life, such as school. He's so busy fighting Pokemon that he doesn't attend school at all. Technically, a person could be diagnosed with conduct disorder with just the 3 criteria I mentioned above. At face value, Red meets criteria for this diagnosis and should join his Nintendo brethren in the conduct disorder club. However, as always, cultural factors need to be considered. For example, going to school doesn't seem to be very important to people in Kanto, which is where Red lives, and thus maybe fighting his Pokemon doesn't interfere with his schooling at all. It's difficult to determine if Pokemon battles are the cultural norm in Kanto, or if they're simply a tolerated but aberrant activity within a small sphere of people. For example, dogfights are common among dogfighters in the United States, but most of the general public would consider this inappropriate conduct. A clue that Pokemon battles are culturally appropriate in Kanto is manifested by the fact that there's Pokemon trainer gyms in each city. These are places where people train and fight their Pokemon. Now, these gyms aren't in darkened back alleys either. These are prominently displayed in the center of town. This tends to lead some credence to the idea that Pokemon battles are an accepted cultural activity there. Red is warned by Professor Oak at the beginning of his journeys that it's dangerous to leave the city as he could be attacked by wild Pokemon. It's because of this warning that Red gets involved in Pokemon training in the first place. It seems as if Red is involved in Pokemon training and battling not just out of personal enjoyment, but because it's a necessary form of protection from his environment. With all of these factors considered, Red does not meet criteria for conduct disorder. If he were to engage in these activities in my neighborhood, he probably would be, but it seems like what he's doing is culturally appropriate conduct for his own environment. Well, no diagnosis for Red so far, but he has another issue worth looking into. So please stay tuned and watch our next episode on Red, where we will talk about his apparent compulsion to catch 'em all. Red has obtained hundreds of Pokemon and seems driven to catch 'em all. He even keeps track of them in a Pokédex, a type of encyclopedia of Pokemon, so he can organize them and catch as many as he can. Does he have obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD? OCD is anxiety-based and involves obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are recurring thoughts that are experienced as intrusive and cause a lot of distress and anxiety. A person will then engage in compulsions, which are like rituals, in order to alleviate the anxiety caused by the obsessions. For example, a person who washes their hands hundreds of times per day isn't doing that because they enjoy washing their hands. They're doing it to alleviate the anxiety caused by their obsessive thoughts, perhaps about germs. A person who obsesses over their personal safety might check the locks hundreds of times per day. A person might think that something bad will happen to them if they don't walk in a certain way, and so they walk in that certain way. A person technically only needs to have obsessions or compulsions to meet criteria for OCD, but there's other criteria as well. One of those criteria is that at some point the person realizes that their obsessions and compulsions are unreasonable. This is a little bit of a nuanced criteria, so allow me to elaborate. Sometimes a person with obsessions and compulsions realizes that what they're doing is a bit much, but at other times they don't realize this. This criteria is met if at any time the person has realized that they're being unreasonable. If a person never realizes that what they're doing is excessive, then another diagnosis might be more appropriate, like one of the delusional disorders or obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, which I mentioned back when we discussed hoarding. Another criteria is that the obsessions and compulsions cause significant distress interfere with someone's life in a big way, or are very time consuming. By very time consuming, I mean they take at least an hour per day. For example, most people occasionally wonder about the locks, so they go and check to make sure the front door is locked. Most people don't go and check the lock for 2 hours every day. Considering all of the criteria for OCD, Red doesn't really seem to fit in the picture. Yes, he vigorously collects Pokémon, and yes, he keeps track of them in almost religious detail in his Pokédex, but none of this seems distressing to him or causing him any anxiety. In short, none of the criteria I outlined before seems to apply to Red at all. A pretty good rule of thumb is that if a person isn't distressed or troubled, then they probably don't meet the criteria for most mental health disorders. Some common exceptions to that would be the personality disorders and disorders where the rights of other people are violated, like conduct disorder. Well, it seems that Red doesn't meet the criteria for any mental health disorder. Keep on collecting, buddy. Next time, our tone will shift a little bit as we discuss the tragic story of a rather interesting video game character, Ethan Mars from Heavy Rain.